Hello, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for logging in to see my talk today, and to Hen B for organizing this conference again. I'm really glad to be participating and presenting this research to you. As the title of my talk suggests, I'm discussing Gregory Mason and the early archaeology of the Rio Frio Caves. More specifically, the talk is about the history of the archaeological collection he made in those caves, an introduction to it, and my recent work documenting it. In many ways, this talk is historical in nature, dealing with the colonial bureaucracy of Belize in the late 1920s. It is an outgrowth of my Rio Frio Regional Archaeological Project investigations in the mountain pine ridge that I began in 2018, with the intent to document the caves Mason reported to contemporary archaeological standards. Much of the groundwork for this research I present today comes from my background studies when I started that project, and really finding something related to it to stay busy during COVID. The work itself, though, was realized during a research leave I took from my university in 2023 that ultimately took me to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Overall, my aim for this talk is to bring awareness to the collection, to tell its story, and present its contents to the Belize public for the first time. The story begins in New York City with George Gustav Heye, who was one of the most prolific collectors of pre-Hispanic artifacts from throughout the Americas at the turn of the 20th century. In 1916, he established a foundation in his name and donated all of his collections to it, creating the Museum of the American Indian, which continued to actively collect archaeological and ethnographic materials from throughout the hemisphere. In 1928, the Heye Foundation contracted Gregory Mason, a famous explorer and archaeologist of the ancient Maya, and who was very popular on the lecture circuit, to lead an expedition to collect ethnographic objects from throughout the Maya region. The expedition, called the Mason-Blodgett Expedition, after sponsor Thomas H. Blodgett, then president of the American Chicle Company, was scheduled to last 4 months, passing through Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. In Belize, the group traveled from Belize City to San Ignacio by motorboat, an important detail of the story that we'll be coming back to in just a few minutes. In San Ignacio, Mason learned of a Mr. Alfred August who held information about a cave in the mahogany forest that adjoins the mountain pine ridge. The cavern was said to have, quote, many rooms filled with pots everywhere, end quote. Considering the purpose of his trip, Mason could not pass up the opportunity to see them, and paid Mr. August to bring him there. Ultimately, he and his team recorded and made collections in 3 caverns, which he named A, B, and C in the order that they came upon them. They are known today as Twin Cave and Rio Frio Cave. Unfortunately, Mason's publications resulting from his trip to the caverns are not overly informative from an archaeological perspective. I'll get to reasons why I believe so in a few minutes, but the only piece resembling a scientific report was published as part of the Heye Foundation's Indie Notes and Monograph series. This monograph, which you can access by scanning this QR code, is physically small. This is a copy of it here. It's roughly the size of a smartphone, 45 pages long, and illustrated with 30 photographs of artifacts, mostly pots he collected in 3 caves and a few other sites on the trip. But the text reads like a verbal walkthrough of the caves, talking about some of the artifacts he collected, but descriptions are unsystematically presented, with different kinds of information given for them. For some, he gives the height of the vessel. For others, he gives the rim diameter. And for others still, he just gives a description of the decorations. When introducing some of the artifacts, he makes reference to others that were found in other parts of the cave or other caves altogether. It's a really confusing report to read for archaeological information. Now, compounding the difficulty of the report is that it includes no maps of the caves, where excavations were made, or even notable features of the caverns that he discusses. It also doesn't include a comprehensive list of what he collected. To my knowledge, that's never been reported. Another major publication of the expedition was offered in part of a chapter in his 1940 autobiography that you see here in the middle. But to write that, he recycled a lot of what he wrote in the monograph. Basically tells the same story, but adds in a few new details here and there. And he includes 4 or 5 of the same photos that he included in the monograph, so there's really nothing new presented there. Now, perhaps the most informative account of the whole expedition comes from a spread of magazine articles titled Caribbean Blue that he authored. In part 2 of the story, seen here, he details the Rio Frio Caves visit. Now, the magazine that he published the story in is Motorboating Magazine. Not the most reputable sources for archaeological information, but he wrote the story there because, as I mentioned before, he traveled the Belize River by motorboat, a relatively new method of travel in Belize at that time. So, what did he take out of the caves? He said most of what he collected were ceramics, and the photos he includes in the monograph back that up, but he discusses a few other kinds of artifacts. Here are most of the photos published. They represent several of the whole and partial vessels he collected, but remember, the physical size of the monograph is small, and the quality of reproduced images makes it really difficult to see well their decorations and other details. Here we see the other artifacts that Mason collected from the caverns. These include objects like the spike censer, a few jade ear spools and beads, and some other stone objects made of slate, metamorphic rock, chert, and limestone. Now, a couple of the reasons I believe that Mason didn't pursue working with the collection is that he was only contracted with the museum to make it, not study it. But another major reason seems to be he doesn't seem to think very highly of it. When shipping it back to the museum, he writes in an accompanying letter, quote, "All in all, it's been quite a hectic 3 weeks here for me. And as I already said, the value of the collection has not justified such a pother. I'm afraid it may not even be worth the cable tolls you've spent, but you'll soon know the worst." And I'll get to the reasons why it was a pother in just a few minutes, but you can see he didn't think very highly of it. Now, because of the overall lack of information about the assemblage in his publications, a primary driver for this project was identifying what he actually took from the caves. He mentions a lot of ceramics, but there are only 30 photos in his book, as I mentioned, mostly of whole and partial vessels. Some clues can be found in his discussing exporting the artifacts in his autobiography. He says he learned that while shipping the assemblage from Belize to New York, he violated the law of the colony by taking it out of the caves without first getting concessionaire status for the colonial government. To remedy the situation, the council needed to reconvene, which took several weeks. When they did finally meet, they did grant him concessionaire status without problem, but as required by law at the time, he had to turn over half of the collection to the colonial authorities. Nevertheless, he was allowed to ship the entire collection to the MAI for investigation. In the letter that accompanies the eventual shipment to the museum, he says his stuff occupies 4 boxes and the colony's half is in 2 other cases, another important clue for understanding the fate of the collection. So how was it divvied up? Again, this is an important part to understanding what happened to it. According to colonial law at the time, a coin would be flipped. Whoever won the toss would pick the first object, the loser picked the second, the winner picked the third, and so forth until the entire collection was sorted. Mason first did this with an individual named Clive Smith, but the colonial authorities soon changed their minds, deciding that he was too young and inexperienced to make proper selections on their behalf. So again, Mason had to prolong his trip and wait for Captain Grunning to travel to town to make the colony's official selections. This is part of why he was waiting for so long. Now here's where the question of whether are the contents of the full collection and what happened to it after Belize gets muddled. In the letter Mason sent to the museum about the shipment, he was told that he could keep the colonial portion for 6 months, but that another archaeologist was allowed to keep a different collection for a year, so he says there's no definitive timeline to return it. And overall, especially in his private writings, he seems to be pretty dismissive of the deadline and the need to return the objects that Captain Grunning selected. So what happened to it? Well, tracing the collection, where the collection wound up, I found that the MAI was absorbed into the Smithsonian Institution in 1989, becoming the National Museum of the American Indian, or NMAI, in Washington, D.C. As part of that move, nearly all of the Heye collection was moved from New York to the Cultural Resource Center in Sweetland, Maryland, just outside of D.C. I contacted them during COVID, and their archivist sent me all of the archives affiliated with the collection. One of the records is the shipping register showing 2 cases sent to the British Museum on January 4, 1929, the same number of cases Mason noted in his letter, and about 6 months after he shipped the collection to the MAI. Staff at the NMAI have indicated that the museum had no other reason to ship anything to the British Museum at the time, and so though the contents are recorded, this is likely the colonial selections. I've contacted the British Museum though, and unfortunately they have no record of the shipment arriving, so what happened to the portion of it after the assemblage was shipped is currently unknown. The NMAI archives also sent me this document titled Field Catalog of Some of the Archaeological Objects Found. This is a list mostly of whole vessels and a few other non-ceramic artifacts, most of which seem to match the figures in the publication. Leading each entry is either an M for Mason or a GOV for government, seemingly representing how the materials were sorted. But in his correspondence with the MAI about the shipment, he notes that the catalog was of the better pieces, not the entire collection, and he made that list when Clive Smith was doing the sorting, not Grunning, and he basically just simply ran out of time to be able to make a proper list of what the government actually chose. So until the shipment to the British Museum is relocated, the full collection will remain unknown. The MAI's full portion does appear in this gift register, though. It notes a total of 491 objects gifted to the museum, 402 of which are listed as potsherds. Now there's many entries about the sherds because they were sorted first by decoration and then by part. Unfortunately, by sorting this way, all provenience was lost on these pieces. Now moving on, if you total my numbers and compare it to the gift register, they won't quite match up. That's because in the register they count numbers of sherds that make up a single vessel fragment. In this summary, instead of counting the pieces, I just tabulated each vessel fragment as a single object. So we see he collected 14 jars and 2 bowl fragments. There are also 6 whole jars and 13 whole bowls. Again, most of these have been illustrated in his publication. Other artifacts listed are a pottery coil, 2 stone balls, 2 chipped stone celts, and 37 univalve shelves. With that archival information in hand, I arranged a couple of trips to the Cultural Resource Center in 2023 to record this part of the collection. Now I want to spend my last couple minutes going over how I've recorded the collection, a couple of the results, and my plans to make the data accessible to the public. Now I still have work to do, but to date I have photographed, weighed, and measured each individual object except for a tray of undecorated body sherds, 2 trays of undecorated jar rims, and 1 of the jar fragments. Of the sherds, I have photographed the front and back sides of each, and using this absolutely wonderful tool called a laser-aided profiler, I made technical illustrations of all the painted rim sherds and all but the largest whole vessels and vessel fragments because they wouldn't fit into the device. Now, this is a really great time-saving tool. I've compiled these drawings into a catalog, and these are just some of the draft pages of it. Now, what you're looking at here is about half of the ceramics Mason collected. In all, about half of the sherds are painted in slipped monochromes and polychromes that date throughout the Classic period. The other half is unslipped material from utilitarian jars and bowls. Perhaps the most unique sherd Mason collected is this one. On the right, you see a color-enhanced copy of it that I made using the ID Stretch app. In it, you can see an outstretched arm with bent wrist, the thumbs and index finger pressed together with the other 3 extended, and the hand is reaching into a sort of a feathery, crenellated object. Now these 2 elements, the outstretched hand and that feathery object, are part of the whole dancer theme found on vessels in the late Classic period at sites with ties to Naranjo. So this is probably a whole dancer style vessel. This piece is one that Mason considered to be his most important, but you can see here that the published photograph of it is, quite frankly, awful. Very little detail is visible in it, but seeing it in color and in person, it really is an extraordinary work of art. I estimate that this is only about 1/3 of the original piece, the top of a really tall cylinder vase. So you can see it better. Here's a roll-up photo that I made of it, and a drawing that my student Brooke Olivier made of the rollout. On it is an eyeball, an ear spool, and the sprouting vegetation. I think this is probably a vessel depicting the sprouting maize god. He notes that this is found in Cave A, and though we've conducted some excavations there, we haven't found any more of it. But I'm hoping as we continue to work there, we may be able to find more and get a better understanding of the vessel. All right, as I wrap up this talk, I want to quickly mention my plans for these data. With over 400 pieces, I couldn't show you everything today, but I am working on getting my photos and technical drawings posted to my project website, riffrep.org, so that folks can explore the collection themselves. I will also be including the catalog of drawings I showed a few slides ago in my next report to the Institute of Archaeology, and I will look to post that to my project website as well so everybody can look through and see that. I want to thank the American Philosophical Society and for the Franklin Research Grant that supported this work, and thanks to Cal State San Marcos for providing sabbatical leave, which I was able to make these visits to the CRC. I also want to give a big shout out to the absolutely wonderful folks at the Cultural Resource Center at the NMAI. From the first moment I stepped in the doors, they welcomed me and made me feel like I was part of their team. They're absolutely wonderful folks doing the good work the right way, working with communities to reconnect them with their past heritage. Thanks also to my CSUSM students who worked with me on these data, and to Hen B for the opportunity to present this assemblage. to you today. Thank you.